All right, we're here. We're live. Episode 35, Lucas Grandsire podcast. People talk about consistency. That has not been the case for this podcast, but going forward, we're going to be live on, I'm trying to do every Tuesday, so hold me to it. It's here on record, but the first guest for the Tuesdays is, of course, Daniel Vreeland, who I put in the bio, works for just about everybody in MMA, podcaster, journalist, all that good stuff. What's going on, man? How are you?
I'm good, man. It's good to be here.
For sure. Listen, I've come on so many of your podcasts. I'm like, at some point, I have to have them on mine. Like, it's only fair. It's only right.
I think you've been on 2 out of the 3 that I do. You were on the Sports Gambling Podcast Network. You were on Prelim Primer. You haven't been on Top Turtle yet, so you haven't hit the trifecta. I don't know if anybody's hit the trifecta, but you're at the top of the list at 2 out of 3.
Would it make sense to go on Top Turtle though? Like, I'm not preparing for a fight.
I've had guests on there before when my other co-host Dave Romani was not there. I had James Lynch came on and did a spot once. We talked about prospects. I had Jeff Fox, who's the guy who actually he might have hit the trifecta then. I had Jeff Fox. Jeff Fox has probably hit the trifecta, and he guest hosted when I needed somebody. But there's not usually guests on Top Turtle that aren't getting ready to punch somebody in the face, which I feel like you're probably not.
You know what? If Brendan Schaub starts mouthing off about me, maybe that could change things right here. Just put it out there.
You're down for a media beef right now?
Oh man, I mean, you'd have to pick someone more realistic than Brendan. Like, I'm a large man. Like, I'm sure I can find a small guy with, or Robbie Fox, or the guy at Barstool, somebody like that. Like, you got to be more realistic. Like, someone, because if you pick on the one former fighter, the one guy that trains, like,
the guy who knocked out Mirko Cro Cop.
Right. Yeah, like, people like to discredit his career, but like, he was there, man. He's on a UFC video game. Like, you know what? I'm not fucking with that guy.
Yeah, and like, everybody loves to play. Was it the Ben Rothwell reaching for birds knockout? Yeah. Everybody loves that knockout. But like, no, if you look at his career, I mean, it's incredible. I think people discredit it more because Joe Rogan shit on him on his podcast more than it was that his career was actually bad. Because also, he didn't retire because he was bad at fighting. He retired because he thought he could be the champion, and realistically, he was somewhere in the number 12 to number 20 range. He was never going to be number 1 or number 2, and there's nothing wrong with being 12 to 20. Andre Arlovsky won this past weekend. He's been 12 to 20 for the last, seems like 10 years, right?
It's I mean, I think the big thing with him is that he wasn't necessarily a bad fighter, but that chin was always going to be a problem. Like, anytime you're getting knocked out by jiu-jitsu guys, and it's like, you're not getting TKO'd, like, you're getting flatlined, like, you just know, like, that's going to be your ceiling, especially at heavyweight.
Well, people said that. I don't mean to keep evoking Andre Arlovsky, and here he is right over my shoulder right here too. He's always watching me while I'm podcasting. But I don't mean to keep evoking Andre Arlovsky. People said that about him too. People said he was chinny, and like, it took him reinventing himself with Mike Brown in deciding that he was a point, like, I don't want to say he's a point fighter, but he's like a point fighter. Yeah. And whether or not he thinks he is, or he thinks he's got to run in him, he's just staying away from the big right hands of guys like Carlos Felipe or Felipe Lins, or like any of those guys. He stays away from the big punch. He plods away. As long as he doesn't run into a Tom Aspinall, he made a second career out of that. So, I mean, like, not saying that Schaub could have done that, because it takes a special kind of wiring and a special kind of coaching. And like, I don't think Schaub has the wiring and the coaching for any of that, whereas Arlovsky did. But like, a lot of people say that when the chin shot, you got to quit at heavyweight. But like, I feel like Arlovsky is, I mean, he's a counterpoint to pretty much every argument, but he's definitely a counterpoint to that argument.
Well, Alistair Overeem's a great one too, because I feel like his whole career, that chin has been an issue. And then people were talking about he looks kind of boring and stuff, but he beat some guys that could have easily knocked him out, like Junior Dos Santos, Mark Hunt, and stuff like that. So, and I mean, he made Stipe tap. So, he figured it out despite, having some serious chin issues. Because when you start counting his knockouts, I believe you're at like over 20 or something crazy like that.
And he was people forget he's 1 second away from beating Jair Rozenstruik, right? Like,
yeah,
I had him in all 5 rounds, including the round he got knocked out in. Like, if we're being honest, the stoppage, you probably could have let him take another punch or two and let the clock expire. He wasn't all the way unconscious. I mean, the lip was gnarly as hell, but like, yeah, like, I mean, like, when all said and done, like, he figured a lot of it out too, for whatever that's worth now that he's back in kickboxing and injured and whatever he's doing now.
Yeah, it's interesting. He's one of those guys I feel like we don't talk enough about, the Uberim, USADA era, and now he looks like he cut down to 205. Like, that just feels like a slam dunk. Like everybody goes after Vitor Belfort, but it's like, man, I mean, seriously, how is Overeem
Yeah.
not in that? Like, I love watching him fight. He's a great fighter, but I mean, seriously, there has to be somebody has to acknowledge that at some point.
Well, yeah, but we do that with everybody, right? Like we pick and choose who we're interested in grilling for USADA suspensions and for steroid suspensions, right? Because you're right. Titor gets it all the time. Overeem doesn't. I mean, when was the last time you heard somebody like legitimately on air talking about Brandon or Brian Ortega's suspension? Because that dude popped too, and like we're talking about him like he's a saint because he's marrying Tracy Cortez,
Right.
and like that's just not the case, right? Like that's not that he popped hot too. Is it Amanda? I don't want to say the wrong name here, but is it Amanda Lemos who took 2 years off for a USADA suspension as well? Came back 2 weight classes lower and is steamrolling people. Like, and again, these are people we just don't even mention that they have, like they popped at any point in time.
It's funny because when you go back and watch some of the older stuff, like a fight I was watching, for example, was what's his name, Rich Franklin versus Evan Tanner, and dude, these dudes back then had some traps. Like, oh my god, none of these guys had these traps, and then everybody talks about them like, everybody was clean, and then maybe Anderson. Like, are you kidding me? Have you seen the traps on these guys compared to today? Like, it is crazy how that flies under the radar.
Well, and I'll say this though too. So I do think you're right. Some people flew under the radar. By the way, I did look it up. It was Amanda Lemos, so I didn't just badmouth somebody who I shouldn't have badmouthed. So that's good. I think you're right to an extent that there were a lot of people who were probably roiding up back then because they weren't getting caught doing it. But I also think some of that like general weird shape you were seeing of fighters back then with enormous traps and shoulders the size of my whole body. And I'm not a small guy either, but like shoulders the size of my whole body. And I think we think, automatically they're on steroids, but it was also a time where we thought that was the optimal shape for a fighter. Like we thought, Matt Hughes looking like a square, because that's what, I mean, he did. And we thought that was optimal. And I mean, if you look at all of the fighters now who are doing the best, you don't find anybody shaped like that anymore, like short Brock Lesnar's, like the last
Just
guy.
the referee.
The last guy who was, the referee does look like that. The last guy who really made runs especially in any lower weight division shaped like that was somebody like Chad Mendez. And you just don't see guys like that anymore. You're seeing guys shaped like Israel Adesanya and Conor McGregor and, even Kamaru Usman's leaner than what guys used to look like. Like you're saying, Rich Franklin, Evan Tanner was enormous. The guy was built like a vending machine. So yeah, we can probably say a bunch of them were on steroids. It's probably safe to say that, but I think too we've just slowly evolved in understanding what like the optimal size is for an MMA fighter.
You're on something about that because I did, I'm in North Carolina. So when it comes to fighters here, we really don't have anybody. But I was at the dog park and there was this guy talking about, for when I'm fighting. And so, the MMA part of your ear sort of, MMA? And then he was explaining like he doesn't lift weights. He does, is it calisthenics? Is that what you call it?
Or plyometrics.
Where you're messing around with
too.
rubber bands. And he's like, because, it's better for mobility and stuff like that. And you just think like, it's crazy because you imagine like back in the day, everybody was drinking a gallon of milk and clanging weights around and stuff like that. So it's interesting how, it's a great point how far people have come sort of in changing their body and especially the movement part.
Yeah. And I think too, if we just go back even like, 5 to 10 years and we're talking about anybody who had that like long, lanky frame, we just automatically assumed they were jiu-jitsu guys. And a lot of times they were, right? Like Tamden McCrory or Dustin Hazlett, or like now you see a guy who walks in looking like Dustin Hazlett and you're wondering if he's about to hit you with some crazy karate kicks or some taekwondo, instead of just being like, oh, that guy is going to need me to take me down, or he's going to get his head punched in, which is what happened to Dustin Hazlett. Like Josh Koscheck punched his brains in and we stopped seeing him like 2 fights later. Same with Tamden McCrory. Like he was around for a little while and then he disappeared into Bellator, back to UFC, but again, away. And it was mostly because those guys in that frame doesn't work if, jiu-jitsu is your only base. But yeah, like I think now we've learned that is a decent base for strikers too. And I actually think if we're trying to like delineate where this came from and that body shape question came from, I think John Jones has a lot to do with it.
True.
Because like if you look at when that started changing, like when John Jones won the title And when John Jones was becoming like the guy at 205, he was beating Shogun, a guy pretty damn muscular. He was beating Rampage. He was beating Rashad Evans. And like, not that some of those guys couldn't strike and stuff like that, but they were built more like the Evan Tanner looking dude. And then as you watched him progress through the division, of course, Daniel Cormier being the outlier, you see him fight longer, lankier guys, right? Like started to see him fight a lot of guys who look like him, like Alexander Gustafsson, really super long, really super tall. You saw him fight Dominic Reyes, really super long, really super tall, and like both of those guys are two of the guys who gave him tougher runs, right? Like in that's part. I think that's part of why is because for a while he was running through people like water, and I think they just weren't used to fighting somebody who looks like that.
Yeah, you're right, because that was always the thing about John Jones. Like, if you can match him size-wise, like Gustafsson 6'5", John Jones 6'4", like if you can match his height and stuff, then you saw him start to have issues like a Dominic Reyes and stuff. That also brings up like how would he do at heavyweight, where there are no more Mark Hunts anymore. Those short guys, the overhands, Roy Nelson, all those they're gone. These guys now, you're seeing the 6'3", 6'4", like those are becoming the normal heights in that division.
Yeah, although I will say there are a couple relics. I've got a big soft spot for the big chunky guy because there are a couple of those relics hanging around. They might not be, Mark Hunt was like a top 4 or 5 guy for a while. Roy Nelson was even like a top 10 guy for a while. But like, so they might not be that anymore. But I mean, Parker Porter's on a 2-fight winning streak, right? And I mean, I would love to talk about the physique of Alexander Romanov. I could talk about the physique of Alexander Romanov for days on end because that guy is not shaped like any other heavyweight right now because he is huge. And I think they list him on the website as like 6'2". No way he's 6'2". He's easily just 6 foot or lower and very big. So there are some of those relics, but you're right. As far as like the Mark Hunt guy in the top 5 doesn't exist anymore. But the other thing I will say, and this is why I'm so curious to see John Jones at heavyweight, legal issues notwithstanding, all of that kind of stuff notwithstanding. We don't even have to get into that. But like, that's why I'm so interested to see him at that weight class because he's changed his body structure, right? Like I talked to Devin Clark a few weeks ago and he was like, John's big. Like that's what he said. He said, John Jones, he's bigger, and he feels bigger. And that to me is a question because wasn't that his thing? Was his thing that he wasn't bigger? And it served him so well. So I don't know that works for him. And it'll be interesting to see if it does against, whatever guy they eventually get him when it comes that time.
That's the thing about John Jones, though, is the thing I always heard about him. Because, at one point, I feel like the Mystique's, it's leaving. But at one point, when the Mystique was at its highest, was just how freakishly strong he was. People are like, you look at him, he doesn't look like it, but he puts the paws on you. Mm-hmm. And you truly feel like, this guy is physically like in another world. And, part of that I feel like is athleticism too. Like some guys just naturally stronger while others have to work at it. But you got to think like if he's even stronger now compared to these big boys, like heavyweight's fun. We could have a lot of fun with John Jones, as long as he's not having the fun he's having outside of the cage. But, it feels like we're being robbed of like, something that could have been great.
Yeah, I agree with you. But in to sort of your point here, you're right. He does have good power. But like, think about the times he unleashed that power, right? Because the complaint is that the Thiago Santos fight, he didn't use it. In the Dominic Reyes fight, he didn't use it. I think in the Gustafsson fights, he did a little bit, but like less so, especially in the second one. But like the times he released it were way back in the day when he was way bigger and longer than everybody he was fighting, and Daniel Cormier, who's much shorter than him. So the question is, when he's matched in size at heavyweight, is he going to release that? And a better question is he going to be able to release it with the speed he did down a division? Because I think obviously that's the huge question, right? Like he's both strong and fast. So if he ceases being fast, is his strength good enough? And of course, he's wildly talented. I don't mean to boil John Jones, maybe the greatest MMA fighter of all time, down to just being fast and strong. But like, he's obviously wildly talented and has tons of skills. But like, what happens when some of those skills are negated?
So speaking of, we talked about the body types, the John Jones stuff like that. Israel Adesanya is obviously someone that comes up. I know for you, you were someone that, and I have to give you a lot of credit because not only were you one of the early ones to talk to him, because I believe you got him right before he signed with the UFC for sure.
Right after he signed with the UFC, but before he debuted. Yeah.
And then you hooked me up with it, and I was able to talk to him a lot, which that clutchest thing in the world. Like I have to tell you to have you on the podcast. But were you one of those victims of he signs it with a new management, all of a sudden everybody's cut off?
I think I got one more interview in with him after he changed management, but then it happens all the time with big
Yeah.
management companies, and I don't even take it personally from the management company standpoint because some of them they change management companies to somebody who I've been working with for a while, and I'm still doing less, or still getting less access to them, or still getting sporadic access to somebody, and it's happened for all different levels of people. Sometimes when people change media companies, and I think haven't done this for, I've been doing like regular steady interviews for almost 6 years, and I've been doing, the writing in general for a decade. I think at a certain point in time, you realize that the reason they change media companies or the reason they change agents, the reason they change companies in general is they need something different, right? And some of it is they need somebody to restrict the access more than they currently are having because they got tons of crap to do, right? Like Israel Adesanya started spending less time interviewing with, every single guy who wanted his hand on him when he started, he had media obligations for Engage when he was doing all the apparel work for Engage. And then was it Puma that he was with? Like he had, Puma shoes all of a sudden all over, and he was doing, advertisements on Instagram, and he was doing commercials, and like he needed to do less interviews with me. Like, and also you don't need to sell your fight when you're Israel Adesanya. You're Israel Adesanya. Like your fight sells itself. So yeah, I got squeezed out. I would say almost completely now. I think I have a way to possibly reach in, but it's like one of those ones where you're like, he's gonna go do the interview with UFC.com, and that's probably it. And good for him because he's sort of earned that right. And I try not to take that personally, but yeah, that is sort of the bane when they switch management companies. Is it seems like you're getting squeezed out by the manager, but I will say I think it's more that it's just what the fighter's looking for at that time.
I'm seeing more and more guys. I know we talked about it, a few days ago, but it was like, guys, I feel like guys don't like doing media as much. And I don't know if that's the media's fault because, it's always, what are your thoughts on your opponent and all that shit. Or if it's just, I'm tired of having to sit down for 10 minutes and have to talk to this guy. Like, but I'm seeing more and more. It seems like people don't enjoy doing media, or the accessibility is not the same as it once was.
I think some of that is because the accessibility at a higher level, or the amount, I guess I would say the demand at a higher level now seems to be greater. Whereas if you go back like let's say 6 years, because that's when I started doing Top Turtle MMA. When you went back 6 years, a guy who was fighting on a co-main event didn't have a media week. You know what I mean? Didn't have to show up at media week to do, the scrums and the conference and like all that kind of stuff. Instead, that person was showing up in media week. He was making sure his diet was right, or she was making sure her diet was right. They were cutting their weight. They were hitting the pads, and then they were showing up for their fight. And, you can squeeze a couple of interviews in there, or you can squeeze an interview in the week before because fight week doesn't feel daunting. And now you have these media scrums, and it's not just number 1 and 2 on the card, and sometimes the co-main event. It's not just the title challengers, but you're getting fighters like, this past weekend they had Manon Fiorot, and she's fighting 4th or 5th from the top. And of course she's a huge prospect. I love Manon Fiorot. I think she's a lot of fun. And I think the UFC knows they have something with her too. But all of a sudden she's doing media scrums that take up almost the whole one of her days. That's part of her training and part of what she's supposed to be doing. And I think because all of those things elevate for people who, and I'm not going to say it's everybody who's ranked or anybody who's close to being ranked, but it's like the people who regularly show up on main cards. It's hard for, I think, them to say, yes, book me for 10 interviews the week before when I have to do all of this too. So I think some of it is that they don't, you're right, that it seems like fighters want to do less of those. But I think some of the reason they want to do less of those is because they're doing more of those in just like a different way.
That makes a lot of sense. I know at one point, you'd see like you'd have an MMA podcast you'd never heard of in your life. You know what I mean? It was like MMA show this, blah blah blah, and they're booking some crazy names. Like you'd see like a Max Holloway pop up. And you're like, the fuck are you doing? Like, who is this guy? How is he booking Max? And the questions are terrible. And it seems like at one point it's like every idiot got access, and you're looking at it and you're like, what on earth? How is this happening? And I guess that's where you bring in like, if you have the right management team, like I don't care if you're with MMA, blah blah blah. If I haven't heard of you, you're not getting this one.
Yeah, well, and again, this is again different world 6 years ago, because when I started Top Turtle MMA, nobody had ever heard the name Top Turtle MMA. Candidly, in retrospect, I don't even really love the name. Let's be real for a second. It's long, it's long-winded. I wound up abbreviating it most of the time. Now it's TTP. It's kind of a brutal name, but nobody had heard of it. If you go back and listen to the first of all, don't go listen to the first episode. I don't want anybody to ever hear those. Hopefully they died in a vault somewhere. They got deleted off of Apple Podcasts or wherever it might exist in the current moment. But like, if you look at the first 6 episodes, I think I had Charles Rosa, Shannon Knapp, who obviously owns Invicta. I had Mark Hunt on, Misha Serkinov, and like, I'm sure I had been writing, so I had some contacts, which is part of why. But like, I said, do you want to do the Top Turtle MMA podcast? And they said yes. Mark Hunt said yes. And I want to say it was like episode 6. And I was like, what? How did I get Mark Hunt? Like, I'm not even somebody who booked. So yeah, I think you're right. Like, unless it's Randy Costa or Adrian Yanez, who seemingly will talk to anybody at any time. God bless those guys. But yeah, now it is harder for the upstarts, I think, to get those interviews and to get your foot in the door, and especially to get the big names, because now the big names barely want to do the shows that have been around for 400 episodes,
Well, going the way you did with the podcast route, like it's very tough if you don't have a backing. Like at one point when I was with FloCombat, people didn't know my name. I was just FloCombat guy, and it didn't matter because people knew FloCombat.
Mm-hmm.
But if I was trying to do that on my own, like make up a name like MMAcomputer.com, whatever, people have, it's very hard without the backing of something big. And obviously FloCombat did come along with you guys, but just trying to do it on a podcast by itself, that's an extremely tough way of trying to do things.
Yeah, it was and it was kind of like a weird undertaking to just, because we actually started on a site called MMA-manifesto.com, which is still up and running. You'll see a lot of the like estimated salary data come off of them. I still occasionally write a couple of pieces a week for them, as mostly like a thank you. That's again Jeff Fox, who's a wizard and pretty much got me everything that I do in this profession, or this gig, or whatever you want to call what I do. He pretty much is the only reason why I do what I do. So yeah, like we started using them as a backing, and then FloCombat came along with Hunter Homstek and proposed that we do it on FloCombat. And obviously we're not there anymore. We're at the CageSide Press. And yeah, I think for a while the backing of having a website and saying it's going to this website was a huge help, but I don't even know that works anymore either. Like when I introduce myself to managers, or when I'm asking a manager, like they ask who's this for, I'm like, my name's Dan Vreeland and I'm a writer, and it will get on one of the sites I write for, because I write for, you mentioned at the top, I write for a lot of places, and it seems like it's changing it every minute, but like, yeah, like now I just say I'm Dan Vreeland, I'm a writer. So like I would say that I feel like the website pull, and maybe it's not because I'm not at Junkie or MMA fighting or something like that, but I feel like the website pull is less in 2021 than it used to be. And again, maybe that's just because there's more sites, they're diversifying, there's good guys at places you've never heard of before. But yeah, like I think back in the day, that was like essential. Like that was a huge piece of how I built my brand, is around the couple of websites that gave me a chance.
I remember you were talking about, letting the first interview die. I know, like, when I started on video, like, my first interview, the problem is I was already established. So the problem is the names were big, so they got views, but the interview was terrible. And, like, my second interview was with Israel, and that one's still one of the most viewed ones today. And I look back on it, and I'm like, oh, no. Like, well, stop watching. I can't delete it. I can't bring myself to do it. I'm like, please stop watching it. Like, and I knew it was bad because when I was at FloCombat, so I sent Hunter the video, and he was like, hey, man, we're going to stick with writing for now. Like, yeah, appreciate you doing that. I was like, oh no. Oh, that's so bad. No.
That's not the kind of answer you want. I dabbled in video for a little bit, and obviously I'm on video right now. It is definitely not my favorite media. Like people who are watching this either live right now or people who are going to watch this on repeat, you'll notice my eyes have gone about 72 different places. I've got a microphone over here. For some reason, I think I have to look at that. There's a camera up here. It's just not for me. That's why I put shit in the background so that you guys look at that instead of my face. Because it's going to dart around and I'm probably not actually looking at the camera very much. But I think that's like it's one of those things that like, you know, and it goes back to what you said about when I started podcasting. I had big guests right away because I had the contact. So it's always weird when you change the media just a little bit, you know, when you go from being just an audio person, you know, which is mostly what I do now, to trying some video and you always wind up with some real duds. I'll tell this story. I did actually just get rid of one of my interviews one time. I pretended I never did it. I won't mention the name of the fighter because I feel like it's almost terrible, but I asked them a question. I asked them a question about one of their training situations and how it's really helped them develop, and you can clearly see the work of that place. And they were like, yeah, I left there like 6 months ago before this training camp. I was like, all right, well, and like scratch those questions off my list of like shit I don't want to talk about. I was like, oh, there goes the next 3 questions and follow up and things I had in my notes. I'm like, all right, well, so then let's talk about the fight then. I'm really interested to see you fight, you know, XYZ fighter. And, you know, like it's great that you finally got this like high level matchup. And he goes, well, actually 20 minutes before you called me, that guy pulled out of the fight. It appears he's got some sort of leg injury. And we're looking for a replacement right now, but we're not sure one will come by next weekend. And I'm like,
what are we doing? What are we doing here?
What am I doing here then? Because you're not with the team I thought you were with. I know. I guess I could ask you about the new team. So I asked him a couple of questions. He's like, yeah, you know, I haven't been there that long, so I can't tell you much about it. So like the interview ended, and I was just like,
fuck.
Well, that was great. And just hit the delete button and was like, well, if the manager ever asks, that there was a problem with the recording. But yeah, that happened one time. And I feel like that was my all-time dud interview. But that's the beauty of when it's an audio interview. You can just say the recording didn't work.
I had one like that with Tanner Bozer, which I know James Lynch remembers because, you know, he watches everything and he happened to watch that one. I did it for Sure Dog. So now even if I wanted to delete it, I can't. But the thing is, normally I'd watch at least one interview the fighter did, maybe look some stuff up. I don't want to do too much research. So I don't want to be, you know, you want to try to make it flow as much as you can. But I did not realize that Tanner Bozer is not a guy you can just go in there without knowing. Like, you have to know this guy doesn't give a fuck. Like, I asked him about his mullet. I was like, what's the story? My barber just cuts it that way. Yeah. And you start sweating because you're like, oh no. Like, every mullet guy loves talking about their mullet. And, you know, I was like, so, you know.
Every mullet guy loves talking about their mullet.
I mean, that's what it, like, what guy have you asked them about their mullet and they haven't given you a 10-minute thing on how glorious it is? Like, that's part of having a mullet.
I actually interviewed Johnny Parsons this week. Didn't even ask him about the mullet, which was maybe a whiff on my part. He should be fighting like literally while we're recording this right now. Yeah. On Contender Series. Didn't ask him about his mullet, so maybe I'm sleeping on the mullet questions.
Apparently not if it's Tanner Bozer. And then Tanner, like, you know, my thing was, so you just debuted in the UFC. Your opponent has more experience than you in the UFC, and he was like, no, like. I've been at ACB before, blah, blah. And it just, the whole interview, I'm like getting shit on by Tanner Bozer. And the whole time you're sweating and you're like, you know, I don't know what to do. Luckily it gave me another shot and I was able to kind of fix it. Cause once you know you can prepare, but when you're in those moments, like, you got to think fast. And chances are if you piss them off, you're not going to fix that thing easily.
Yeah. I actually, so speaking of, so I have this picture of Andre Arlovski. I don't mean to keep reckoning. We're going to talk about it. This is just going to be the episode about Andre Arlovski.
Yes.
So I was a big fan of Andre Arlovski growing up. He's one of the only reasons I started watching MMA. Andre Arlovski, Chris Lieben. Those were my 2 guys. So I got a chance to interview Andre Arlovski once. And of course, you know, especially when you're new to interviewing, I want to say he was on episode like 14 or something like that at Top Turtle. And again, when you're new to interviewing, you're sweating no matter who you're interviewing. I'm interviewing a former UFC champ. A guy was the reason I started watching MMA for the most part. And it was right in the heyday of one of John Jones's 82 scandals. And he was training still at Jackson Wing. So I was I had to ask, right? Yeah. Like, you're supposed to, like, your editor would beat the hell out of you if you found out you had a guy from Jackson Wink and you didn't ask a question about John Jones. So I asked him and he just said, I am not answering any more questions about. And then he paused and then said about John Jones. And I was like, whew, okay, I thought I was losing the interview right there. At least he's willing to answer a couple more. So we just edited that little piece right there, right out of the episode, and got right on to questions about. I mean, he's not like a really easy guy to get a quote out of anyway, but like, especially like his most recent interview. I don't mean to keep going back to what he did this past weekend. Yeah, this past weekend. Yeah. But like, his post-fight interview was hard to understand. I don't know if he was exhausted or if his English has gotten worse somehow, but like he was really hard to understand, right? Like that's not just me.
No, everybody's talked about his English has somehow regressed. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that was the other time where I almost badly botched an interview.
Let me say this about Andrei Arlovsky, since this is the Andrei Arlovsky episode. Apparently,
I'm glad I hijacked it.
You have to. He's right behind you. You have to give him credit. But apparently, and I don't know how much of this I can say, but I'm still going to say it's my podcast. Apparently, there's a big scoop about Andrei Arlovsky since the start of his career. And I believe 2 journalists have that scoop. And one of them has dibs on when they get to release it. I don't know what it is. And when I found out about it, like, I don't know what it is, but when I heard there was something, your mind starts racing. You're like, what is it? Maybe, who knows? It's fucking Andrei Arlovsky. But apparently there's something out there, something big. And I know who the journalist is that has the scoop. And I hope it gets released soon, because apparently there's something big with Andrei Arlovsky that, apparently he's supposed to be released at some point.
I got to imagine. So here's me. I'm going to play Wander Out Loud, which is probably wildly irresponsible. Like he's from Belarus, right? Like,
yeah.
Is there a possibility he was in like a Belarusian spy system or something? Like I would allow that. Mirko Krokop was a cop, and like we got Paulo Tiago, Paulo Tiago was a special ops fighter or a special ops guy for Brazil. We got Benoit Saint Denis, who's fighting this upcoming weekend, I believe, against Elijah Zaleski dos Santos. Oh no, 2 weekends from now. He was a special forces guy in France for a little while. So like, it wouldn't surprise me if that was, but like, is that a big enough scoop to hold secret until he was, I'm assuming until he's retired?
My thing was like, maybe it's something like, he's in the country illegally, you know what I mean? Or maybe something like, I'm thinking like something, you'd have to think something crazy. I mean, we saw him on a train fighting Denzel Washington at some point. So you're like, hopefully it can be something pretty crazy with Andrei Arlovsky.
But if he was in the country illegally, he leaves the country a lot too, right? Like he was popular for having fought in all of those foreign cards, right? Like
but you got to think he's been a UFC guy for a very long time, and the UFC takes care of their people. Yeah, so maybe the UFC did some shady shit themselves. Like,
yeah, I don't know, but again, does that feel big enough to?
No, you're right. Like,
hold on to that scoop. Like that's not like a big scoop, and like. Also, if you have that scoop, how do you only have that scoop and not the U.S. government? Like, I feel like.
Actually, I know how they have that scoop, because see, this is all stuff I have, and I'm pretty sure it's like I gotta be careful with it. But it's like, damn, you hear that and you're like, damn it, like how can you just sit there? It's like I have this big scoop. Boop, here you go. And I mean, selfishly, you're like, if I had the scoop, you know what I mean? Like, could you imagine what it would do? But obviously, that's not how it works. But still, like, you're like, what could be that big? And everybody's got to keep it a secret, and one guy has dibs on when they're going to release this thing.
Yeah, I can't think of anything that would be that big. I mean, unless it's something that would absolutely shock us, which is what it's supposed to be. And
yeah,
that's again why we can't think of it, because otherwise it wouldn't shock us.
Or it could be just something silly like, he failed the test for steroids early on. It's like, who gives a shit?
He probably did. But
like, I mean, yeah, but that's not scoop worthy. Like,
he was fighting in an era where every heavyweight was on the good stuff.
Yeah,
like you were talking about body shapes. That is where we could. I mean, like, then all of the best heavyweights were in Pride, right? With the exception of Arlovsky and however you wound up feeling about Tim Sylvia. Like, no offense to Tim Sylvia. Like, he was really good. He obviously beat Arlovsky a couple of times. But, like, if you're saying, like, all of the elite heavyweights at that time were somewhere, it wasn't the UFC. So, like, most of them were in Pride, where the contract, like, almost explicitly states we won't test you for steroids. Have at it. Like, go get yours.
But honestly, I'm not mad at it, because at this point, it's like everybody knows. So if you chose not to take steroids and you come out there mushy and you get killed by a guy with a 10-pack, that's on you, because you could have taken the juice just like they did. You know what I mean? I feel like if it's an even playing field like that, I'm not completely mad at it. And I love the craziness of Pride, so
Yeah.
I'm not mad at it.
I'm okay with it in retrospect. I think, like, and they've had this debate about baseball too, right? Like, if everybody's juicing, isn't it fine, right? Like,
Yeah.
can't we just send them all syringes, right? But the problem with that too is then that, like, you basically tell any up and coming baseball player, and this
Right.
is, this is not even with brain injury being at the forefront of your thought process, or limb injury or anything like that. But when you do that with a baseball player, you tell any up and coming baseball player, if you're serious about that, you're going to shorten your life with steroids. And if you want to make it, you're going to shorten your life with steroids, because otherwise you're not going to. So then it becomes a moral decision about pressure and what we're doing to people. But I agree with you on the front of Pride. Like, I'm glad Pride existed, because we get to talk about what just, like, absolute nonsense Pride was at sometimes, and also, like, how beautifully crazy it was at other times. So yeah, like, I'm glad that happened, but I do think that's not anywhere we can continue going, where we're like, yeah, just let them all do it.
No, you're right, because if you look at a sport like bodybuilding, where you ask all those guys, we're all clean, man. This is genetics. No, it's not. It's most definitely not. Anybody who's honest about it is like, look, if you don't take steroids, you're not competing in bodybuilding. So you can take a sport like that, where that's the one where everybody's taking steroids, and you can see the effects it has on people. Or Ronnie Coleman can't even walk. Like, you can see this is what happens when you let everybody juice. In this case, obviously it's a more extreme example, but if you needed some sort of what would it look like, you have that image on a slightly different sport.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example of, like, and then you add in traumatic brain injury of punching somebody, right? Like, so when you add that on top of it, like, it's a no-brainer that you, like, while we went down that road, in a dark road in Japan one time, we can't ever go down it again.
But I kind of love it, because now we get to look back, we get to appreciate Pride, and I love when somebody who likes UFC or likes MMA, whatever the people call it, when they're out in the wild, but they'll come up to me and they're like, one guy was like, I had a bunch of Pride tapes, like Rampage slamming people, and it's like, yes, that's the kind of stuff you want to remember. Is the things like that we don't quite see in the UFC anymore, but that was the place for that sort of nonsense, that kind of Michelle Pereira craziness.
But that kind of nonsense, I think, while we associate it with Pride, happened all the time. And again, not even just, like, that many years ago, but 10 years ago, that kind of stuff happened in a lot of wild places, because MMA, before it got refined to the level it's at, was more open to having those crazy moments happen all the time. Like, I point people back all the time to Tony Amaba's submission of Jorge Masvidal back in, like, I think that's Bellator 1 or 2. It's somewhere in the first 5 Bellators, where Tony Amaba throws up an inverted reverse triangle. You watch Jorge Masvidal try to stand up. He passes clean out while seemingly in a position that most people thought he was in, like, a good spot. And he stands up and just falls over. And you're right. We're not going to get that anymore, right? No, everybody knows what happens when they're in a triangle choke, because we've refined the game, and everybody knows to stay away from that inverted triangle. And we might get an inverted triangle turned into an armbar or something at some point in time, where somebody slips into something that they shouldn't. But at the end of the day, like, the reason why we loved the Pride stuff wasn't just the steroids, right? It wasn't just the rule set. It was that at that point in time, there was such a wildly different understanding of what MMA was, right? Like, there were people who thought they could get by with one art. There were people who thought, like, this is a good idea. And, like, now we've seen that idea proven bad 7 or 8 million times, and now nobody does it, right? Like, when Ricardo Arona goes to get picked up for that triangle choke slam, he hooks the leg with his upper arm instead and grabs around the foot so that he doesn't go for a ride, or he lets go when he gets in the air. And we saw Matt Hughes put, was it Carlos Newton? Carlos Newton. Yeah, he put Carlos Newton out with the same thing. After we've seen it twice, when was the last time you saw somebody actually get slammed in a triangle choke again? Like, it almost never happens. I think Pat Barry did it to Stefan Struve and still got tapped out because it's Stefan Struve, and he didn't have that far to fall, because Pat Barry's 5'8". So like you don't see it anymore, because people know, hey, that's a bad idea. I saw Ricardo Arona lose his brain that way. So, like, I think some of it, you're right, is the steroids, is the rule set. We associate it with Pride more than anything, but I think it was happening everywhere, and it was what we loved about those early eras of the sport. And I don't even know how far I can go back with you, because you're like 10 years younger than me, right? So at least 10 years younger than me. So like, if we go if we go way back, part of what we loved about the sport back then was it was unpredictable in a way that now when we break down fights aren't unpredictable, right? Like we see shit we don't expect all the time. Like I didn't expect Nate Landwehr to go to his wrestling and jiu-jitsu this past weekend. That was shocking to me, but I knew he had it. And I also know that like anybody who does MMA knows what an anaconda choke is, right? Like it wasn't like, holy shit, why is his arm there? Because that's what it used to be like. What is that guy doing? How did he get there? And it was because we as viewers largely were less educated. The announcers were sure as hell less educated. God bless Mike Goldberg, but they were way less educated back in the day, and the fighters were less educated. So yeah, like I think Pride, you're right. Rule set steroids helped us feel that way, but I also think just like a lack of knowledge, ignorance was bliss in this case.
All right, so listen, before we let you go, because I believe we did go over the time I had said, I like talking about the covering the sport and stuff like that. For you, what's your what's the long-term plan here for MMA? Because you're in a tough spot where it's like you can't just tell the wife and kids and everybody like bye-bye, I'm gonna go the unpredictable route. What's kind of your long-term goal for covering MMA?
So I mean, that's a really great question. So when I started doing it, I started writing a blog when I was in college, where I just covered the prelims back when there was something called dark prelims. This may predate your viewing, where you couldn't watch the prelims when they happened. They were dark. And then for a while you could watch them on Facebook, there was the Facebook prelim era where you could watch like 2 of the Facebook prelims, and then the other 4 of them were not viewed. You'd have to read results off of UFC.com or somebody who had media credentials. So I started giving people background information using ShareDog's database and whatever I could find about the fighters, about what was going to happen in those fights and trying to predict them. And that's kind of what I still do with the prelim primer, is like although way easier to access information about guys on the prelims now. So when I started it then, the idea was just like, I write. That's what I do. I have actually 3 degrees in English. So I have degrees in English. I like writing. I like watching MMA. So I'll just do this as an exercise to be good for writing. I never really thought I would make any money doing it. That's when I met Jeff Fox, again, the guy who runs MMA-manifesto.com. He's an editor for the Sports Gambling Podcast Network. And that's where really everything took off, because he gave me a chance to write stuff, barely paying me, if paying me at all at that time. And so like when I started making a little bit of money, and then I wrote he got me into writing for Fight Magazine shortly thereafter. And I was making really good money for Fight Magazine. Although they still, I think, owe me some money when they went bankrupt.
Just tossing it out there.
Just tossing that out there. If anybody knows the whereabouts of the former editor of Fight Magazine, you can give my number. But like I made some good money with Fight Magazine. I actually bought my wife's engagement ring with the money I made off of Fight Magazine.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's something.
That's when I was like, if I like sunk a little bit more of my free time in this, I could make some nice money doing it. And so like right now I picked up a whole bunch of gigs, and it like, makes it so right now my wife doesn't work, which is pretty damn cool. She gets to stay home with the kids. I don't have to worry about sending them to daycare, especially, which was really nice during these past 2 crazy ass years where you don't want to have kids in daycare right now. So long-term plan was always write and have fun. So I would say the long-term plan is still to write and have fun. And when it's not fun, I'm going to stop doing it. I don't think I ever thought that this would be my full-time job. And it's not my full-time job. For those of you who don't know, I'm a public high school teacher. I teach English at a public high school. So it's never been my full-time job, and it won't ever be my full-time job. The insurance and pension are better as a teacher. But like, as long as I love it, and as long as I'm enjoying it as much as when I started that blog in college, I don't really see any reason to stop. Like, I like talking to fighters. I like talking to you. I like talking to people when I do the prelim primer. I like the articles I write. Everybody runs up against a deadline and gets sick of it once in a while, but like, I like them enough that it never makes me feel like I want to quit. And when I do, you probably just won't see me anymore. You would, and I don't mean like you just won't see me you won't see my articles popping up, but like I'll disappear off of Twitter, and you just
Oh
like
no.
I won't exist in the media space anymore. And like, and I don't mean that offensively, but like for me, and like it's different for every person who covers the sport and is lucky enough to cover it full or part or even a quarter of the time. It's about a lifestyle for some people, and it's about a means of living for another people, and it's a dream for other people. It wasn't even ever really something I dreamed of doing. Like I started doing it for fun, and then it evolved into something a little bit more than that, a little bit more than that, and always at the back of my mind, the key to me is it needs to keep being fun. And when it's not fun, I mean, unless the money was insane, and you know as well as I do, the money's not usually all that insane. Spoiler alert for anybody who doesn't work in MMA media. But like, unless the money was insane, like I don't need it. So unless it's great, and it feels great, and I'm still enjoying it, it won't be something I do. So the long-term plan is just hope it stays fun. And that's, I know that's like a weird statement, but yeah, like it is what it is right now. And I hope the pay stays good and the job stays fun.
Yeah, you're so right about that fun thing because how many people have we seen step away from it because they said not only was covering it not fun, MMA wasn't fun anymore. They're
Yeah.
like, all I'm thinking about is I got to ride, I got to this, like, and that's what I'm scared of too. Is the whole time we're like, what if this stops being fun? Because at some point, passion can, for the sport and everything, can only take you so far. And you make such a great point about when it's no longer fun. Then it's time to make a decision.
Yeah. And again, I find myself uniquely lucky in the way that like, some people talk about having poured everything into it. And, you mentioned James Lynch's name, and, I see these young up and comers come through roughly around the same time as I did that are literally pouring everything that they possibly can into. They can't talk about it like I do. And I don't mean that in a terrible way, but like when you have something else that you do full time, and you have something else that you care about, and something that you're passionate about, like you can't just say like it needs to be fun, right? Like, because then it needs to be something. But you saw it with, I don't know if you ever listened to Heavy Hands with Patrick Wyman. Like that was one of my favorite.
Oh yeah, me too.
It was one of my favorite podcasts to listen to. And no offense to the two guys who run it now, Connor Rebush and Phil McKenzie. But like it was less fun for me to listen to when Pat Wyman left. I listened to it less often. I still listen to it once in a while. But like for him, it was the same thing, right? Like covering MMA for him and doing the Heavy Hands podcast. I'm assuming he made a bunch of money off their Patreon and all that kind of good stuff. But he's got a PhD. He runs the history one he does that I don't listen to either.
What is it? Tides of
Tied to
something?
history. Tied to history. Yeah. Tied to history.
There
like
we go.
He runs that, and he has a PhD, and like he writes books and stuff.
He was
like
on
that.
Jeopardy.
Yeah, he's on Jeopardy. Like he's got stuff going. So when MMA became not fun for him, he had the ability to do that. So I find myself, I'm not Patrick Wyman. I don't have a PhD in anything. I did mention I have a couple of degrees or a few degrees, but one of them is not a PhD. So I'm not quite in the same position as him, but I feel like in that sense where like when it's just not fun and it's not something I like doing anymore. Like I said, if he didn't have that other podcast, you just never see his ass again, right? Like, you'd see his book come out and he'd do a book tour when that happened. But like, I don't have a book coming out anytime soon. You don't have any other reason to follow me. And so, yeah, when it stops being fun, I mean, like, I feel like that's the end. And, maybe I'll find a renaissance after that, whatever that gap is, because it's inevitable, right? Like there's a beginning and an end of everything. But yeah, my long-term plan is do it as long as it's fun. And when it stops being fun, stop doing it.
I feel like that's a great place to end on right there. Words of wisdom for anything. So listen, we end the things by, letting you plug your stuff. So social media, you have a billion websites.
Geez.
You can go 10 minutes just naming everything. So if you have any work, any podcast, stuff you want to plug, man, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so the first thing I will definitely plug is I started writing for a site recently, and I mentioned I write for a whole bunch of places, and I'll mention them all at some point in time. But the one I really want to plug right now, I've been writing for this new site called The All-Star. You can find it at theallstar.io. They've got a great app. They're doing tons of great technical pieces. You can see interviews with my guy JHK or JKH. JHK. And Adam Martin's on there too, doing some preview pieces and some gambling pieces as well. they're running everything ad free, doing things. They're trying to do the things the right way, and I really think there's somebody who everybody should keep an eye on. So the allstar.io is where you can check them out. Of course, you can check out Top Turtle MMA podcast, wherever it is you get your podcasts. If you subscribe to that feed, you'll also get the prelim primer each and every week that there is a UFC event where I break down just the prelims with a guest. You can also find that on the Fanatics MMA app. If you have that app and you do picks as well, it just randomly appears right before you're about to pick your prelims. It reminds you that you can listen to me tell you who to pick. So listen to those two podcasts. The Top Turtle MMA podcast appears on CageSide Press, which I usually do an article for a week or 2 articles a week sometimes. MMA-manifesto.com. Again, he gave me my start. Jeff Fox, great dude. Always check out what he's got going on. And then the last place I do is the Sports Gambling Podcast Network, which is sg.pn. You can check them out. I not only do MMA writing for them, but recently had been doing a whole bunch of MMA writing or MLB writing for them, as well as a little bit of basketball writing, which is was a little bit outside my wheelhouse. But, again, when it's fun, it's fun. So I keep doing it there. And I run their MMA gambling website or the MMA gambling podcast off of there, along with Jeff Fox, which he co-hosts with me every week. And sometimes when he's on vacation, I have Lucas Grandsire fill in for him. So, yes. So make sure you check out. I mean, feel free to rewind that and check out any of those 100 places. But the easiest place to find it all too is if you follow me on Twitter. I am at Gumby Vreeland on Twitter. And you can find literally everything that gets posted with my name attached to it winds up on that feed at some point in time. So follow me there.
There we go. Can't argue with that. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on, man. This is awesome. For the people that made it to the end, holy shit, you made it to the end, man. That never happened. So appreciate the people that made it this far. We'll be back next week on Tuesday, and we'll see everybody soon.